Hi, everybody, and a very pleasant good evening to you wherever you may be. Lucky Strikes blowing smoke rings at you from the studios of Comfortably Zoned Radio, and it's time for Dodgers baseball, a tale of two cities from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. I'm your host, Peter Trunk. My co-host is on assignment, Ron Rabinovitz. He's on assignment. He may be joining us later. And I'm proud to say that once again, my guest tonight is baseball and Brooklyn Dodger historian Bill Hall. Bill, how are you?
Peter, good evening. I'm great, and I am so honored to be with you and with your audience one more time here on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
Well, I'm sure it's not going to be your final time, but welcome, welcome, welcome. We always look forward to you with your great stories. I understand tonight that you want to regale us with some stories about Pistol Pete Reiser. And before we start with Pistol Pete, I was reading a couple of things the other day that when I read them, I said to myself, you know what? Let me jot these down because they're kind of funny, and they have to do with Billy Loes, the right-handed pitcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And I have a couple of things. Now, everyone knows, you know, the first thing out of a baseball fan's mouth, our age anyway, you know, oh, he lost the ground ball in the sun.
Sure.
You know, that's the big one. He lost the ground ball in the sun. Well, he actually did lose a ground ball in the sun, and it was in the World Series, and it was at Ebbets Field, and it was explained to me how that's possible by Carl Erskine. Yeah. He told me that between the first and second decks there was no back wall, and when the sun was setting in October, it shone through the decks, and a high-bouncing ground ball back to the mound definitely would hit that sunshine, and you could, in fact, lose a ground ball in the sun. But that's the story everyone remembers about Billy Loes. I have a couple of them. I'm going to give one.
Sure.
I'm going to tell you a little story, and then maybe I'll give you another one at the end of the show.
Sounds like
after Billy Loes was retired. Well, first of all, right before he retired, he was originally selected by the New York Mets from the Giants in an expansion grab, and he refused to go to the Mets. He in fact, retired instead. He didn't want to go to the Mets. But after he retired, he lived in Jackson Heights, New York, and he had weekly card games after his retirement with some pretty notorious neighborhood guys with crooked noses, etc. And sometimes the stakes got out of hand. They got up into the thousands, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500, 3,500. We're talking big money back in 1963, 4. And like I said, this was a weekly game, poker game. And word spread throughout the neighborhood that this happened on a given night. I'm just going to guess it was a Saturday night. I'm not sure what night it was. Let's say it was a Saturday night.
Sure.
One Saturday night after many card games and Saturday nights, the game was canceled. Mm-hmm. A few guys couldn't make it, etc., whatever. But Billy Loes was visited that night by a couple of mob guys toting sawed-off shotguns, looking for an easy heist. Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And Billy was held down, a gun to his head, and he said, "I have no money." And they said, "What do you mean you have no money?" He said, "The game was canceled this week." You're right in thinking that there's usually money being bandied about here in my den. But tonight, there's not a dollar. No one came. It was canceled. It was called off. So the mob guys got really pissed off, and the only thing they could do was steal his World Series ring. And they did that. They stole his 1955 World Series ring and bopped him on the head for good measure. And as he's lying on the rug in his den and the mob guys are leaving, he is known to have called after them, before you leave, set the place on fire. I need the insurance money.
And I bet they didn't even follow through for him.
They didn't even follow through for him. No, they did not.
Dang.
But that's a funny Billy Loes story.
That is classic.
Yeah, Billy was quite a character, as we all know.
Yeah, let me throw one of my own out there, and I'm betting you know the punchline, but just in case, that's okay. But this one is probably almost as well known as the ground ball in the sun.
Okay.
Let me ask you, my friend, and, you know, I'm betting you'll know, but if you don't, I understand, too. Why did Billy Loes say he never wanted to win 20 games in a single season?
Well, he said that if he won 20 games in a single season, they would expect him to do it every year.
Exactly. Yes.
And that's why he didn't want to win 20 games.
Exactly.
Going along, that's funny. That he was a crackpot. But going along with that same story, a codicil, if you will, to that story, an addendum.
Yeah.
Billy Loes, when he signed his 1953 contract with Buzzy Bavasi, Bavasi was very, very proud and happy because in 1952, Billy Loes had gone 13-8. He had won 13 games.
Yes.
And when he offered Billy Loes a raise from $10,000 to $13,000, and he said, "This will be $1,000 a win. It'll come out to $1,000 a win." And Billy thought that was great, and he signed his name. Well, the 53 season starts, and it's August, and Billy Loes wins on the road for the Brooklyn Dodgers, wins his 13th game. He beat the Cardinals in late August. He asks Lee Scott, the traveling secretary in the clubhouse, for a ticket home. and Scott says to him, "What are you, crazy? What do you mean a ticket home? We're going to Chicago and Cincinnati, and then we go back to Brooklyn." Loes says, "I won my 13. I'm going home."
I met my end of the bargain.
I met my end of the bargain, and that's a classic Billy Loes. That's a classic Billy Loes story. It really is.
Oh, I love it.
And he was quite a pitcher, though, you know. He was not a bad pitcher. He was not a bad pitcher. People think, you know, well, he was a little loose in the noggin and stuff, and he said some crazy things, and he had some paternity suits against him and stuff, and this was radical back in the 50s, early 50s and stuff. But they don't, you know, if they looked up his record and looked at his stats, and let's face it, that's what baseball is all about, stats. His stats are outstanding.
They really are.
He was nowhere near a Hall of Fame pitcher. Don't get me wrong, but he was definitely not. He was definitely not the middle of the pack type of guy.
No,
he was a solid.
Yeah, number 2 starter is the way I think of him. You know, he's not the guy. He's not your ace, but if he's number 2 or number 3 in your rotation, you're going to be in the hunt for the pennant every single year.
Exactly. In 52, he won 13 games. In 53, he won 14 games. In 54, he won 13 again. And in 55, the World Championship year, he won 10 and lost 4. He had good seasons. He really did.
Yes,
he really did. Billy was quite a pitcher. He knew how to pitch. He wasn't one of those guys who just reared back and fired. He knew how to pitch. And I personally don't think he gets credit for that because there's so many buffoon stories about him and comical stories about him.
Yeah.
But he was quite a hurler for the Brooklyn Dodgers.
A smart pitcher, and yet I think he always goes down in history as somewhat the court jester of the Dodgers, the funny man, even though he was so much more than that, as you have so wisely pointed out here, Peter. But that's a good counterpoint to our other subject for tonight, the man who I think of almost as the Prince Hamlet of the Brooklyn Dodgers.
And
that could be Harold Patrick Reiser, better known as Pistol Pete, Pete Reiser.
Right.
Perhaps, an absolutely brilliant ball player with a fatal flaw. a recklessness, much like Prince Hamlet, a recklessness that he did not know how to temper. You know, and again, the Shakespeare comparisons just come cascading into my fevered brain. I think of another line from one of the sonnets where Shakespeare said, "There is no perfection so absolute that some impurity doth not pollute." And that is the story of Harold Patrick Reiser, I really believe. Nice. So, you mind if I just start spinning and you jump in anytime you like? Because
absolutely, but before you do that, I definitely want to. I'm going to sit back and listen. He's one of my favorite ball players of all time. How did he get his nickname Pistol Pete?
As a child, he loved Westerns. He always, often as a child, walked around his neighborhood in St. Louis with a pair of toy six-shooters. And he also liked a cowboy hero named Two-Gun Pete. So far before his professional baseball career, you know, it has, a lot of people think maybe it had something to do with his baseball skills, but absolutely not. That's where the name Pistol Pete came from. That's
why I wanted to get that off the table right away. So I wanted you to explain it. You explained it much better than I could have. And now we'll go right into it. Let's dive right in. Pistol Pete Reiser. Tell us about it.
Let's talk about this legendary ball player. I mean, first, when you talk about Pete Reiser, the legend, of course, is what might have been. And one of the amazing things in baseball are the great what-if stories. You think, what if Sandy Koufax hadn't developed an arthritic elbow and had to retire at age 30? What if Tony Conigliaro hadn't been hit by that Jack Hamilton fastball? What if Herb Score hadn't taken that line drive in the eye from Gil McDougall? What if? But really, I think to any true baseball fan who knows the history, the whole historical sweep of the game, is what if Pete Reiser hadn't run into that outfield wall in St. Louis in 1942 and then continued to run into outfield walls again and again and again. And, you know, people, if they know Donald Honig, one of the great oral historians in the game, the man who followed in the footsteps of Larry Ritter with the great book, The Glory of Their Times, in one of Honig's early books, Baseball When the Grass Was Real. He interviewed Pete Reiser, but he had featured up front in Pete's chapter a critic, a poet, and a novelist named David Markson presented what he thought the Hall of Fame plaque of Pistol Pete would have looked like. And he had Pete enjoying a 23-year career with the Dodgers, winning 11 National League batting championships, taking the career hit record away from Ty Cobb, being named Player of the Decade for both the 1940s and the 1950s. Yeah, somewhat fanciful, but it could have been. It could have been. Because let's start off. Let's go back to the young man named Pete Reiser growing up in St. Louis, where Branch Rickey was the general manager of the Cardinals. And at age 15, he goes to a Cardinals tryout camp, even though it's only supposed to be for 16-year-olds and older. He thinks he's got the stuff, and he's going to show them, and he's going to get signed by the Cardinals. Well, heartbreak and disappointment for young Pistol Pete. He gets cut the first day, and he comes home, and his father tries to console him, and he says, "Pete, son, you're only 15. You'll be able to come back next year." But that very evening, a knock comes on the door from a Cardinal scout, and not just any Cardinal scout. It's Branch Rickey's brother, and he reveals that, in fact, Pete had made an impression at the tryout. And even more, he reveals that the Cardinals had been watching young Pete since the age of 12. But they didn't want to, but they didn't want to tip their hand. They didn't want to let anybody know that they were interested in this boy wonder. And so basically they told Pete, just bide your time, and we will sign you, and you will become a St. Louis Cardinal, and you will become one of the greats of professional baseball. And in fact, in 1937, Pete graduates from high school. He is signed by the Cardinals, and they send him to a Class D league. And he has, for an 18-year-old, a pretty good debut in professional baseball. Doesn't set the world on fire, but he bats .283, and everything looks good. And then the specter of Kennesaw Mountain Landis comes on the scene, the High Commissioner of Baseball. And Kennesaw Mountain Landis, as you well know, my friend Peter, and I think probably most of our loyal listeners who know baseball history know, Kennesaw Mountain Landis hates Branch Rickey. He hates him for several reasons, including the fact that he has created the first true farm system in baseball. He, in the mind of Kennesaw Mountain Landis, this is a chain gang. This is slavery. Landis believes that baseball should operate as it had since the dawn of professional ball, where minor league clubs are independent. They compete every year for the pennant, and they make their keep, and they earn their money by selling players to higher classifications. And the farm system goes against everything that Landis believes in, so in an attempt to strike a blow, Landis frees, I believe it was 75 Cardinal farmhands. Does that number ring true with you? He declares them free agents able to sign with the highest bidder. And so what happens then after that 1937 season, Branch Rickey picks up the phone and he calls the offices of the Brooklyn Dodgers at 215 Montague Street in Brooklyn, New York, and he speaks to Larry MacPhail. And talk about two more diverse personalities you could not imagine than Branch Rickey, the pious Methodist teetotaler, and Larry MacPhail, the roaring redhead, the alcoholic, the manic depressive. And yet, when Larry MacPhail was a furniture company executive, I believe it was, in Columbus, Ohio in the 1930s, somehow he came to the attention of Branch Rickey, and Branch Rickey hired him to run the Columbus Redbirds, who were then the top Cardinal Farm Club. And from there, he makes the jump to the Cincinnati Reds, and he proves to be one of the great innovators and in the history of the ball game, introducing night ball, introducing Red Barber as the first play-by-play announcer for the Cincinnati Reds. And then a few years later, when the bankrupt Brooklyn Dodgers try to lure Branch Rickey away from St. Louis, he says, no, but why don't you hire my protege, MacPhail? So now MacPhail is truly in the position of owing Rickey a favor, and they strike a deal in which MacPhail will sign Pistol Pete Reiser, bury him in the Dodger farm system for 3 years, and then trade him back to the Cardinals. And everything seems to be working until Leo DeRocher upsets the plan of these two wily executives, because Leo DeRocher, named player manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1939, sees this amazing young man and says, this is the greatest ball player I've ever seen. I'm going to play him in spring training, even though he is 20 years old. I think he is a major league superstar of the future. And MacPhail tells him, no, 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 you cannot play this kid. If you play him, you're fired. And so for the first of an estimated 70 times, Leo DeRocher defies Larry MacPhail, He plays young Pete Reiser. Larry MacPhail fires him. And then tearfully, soberly, the next day, Larry MacPhail rehires DeRocher, but the cat is out of the bag. This young superstar shows what he can do, and reluctantly, Ricky agrees that there is no way that he can, that the deal can happen without attracting the attention of the Lords of Baseball. Mm-hmm. So, 1940 rolls around, and
let me just add one thing.
Sure.
That's a wonderful story, told very well. I believe in spring training that year, when DeRocher did play Pistol Pete.
Yeah.
Somewhere I read, and the numbers might not be right on the money, but somewhere I think I read that his first 12 plate appearances, he reached base. Pistol Pete.
Every single time.
In spring training.
Yeah.
I think he was 12. I'm not saying he got 12 hits and 12 at-bats. What I'm saying is he reached base in his first 12 plate appearances. I believe that's true.
I believe you're correct.
And that's why Leo went apeshit. He said, this is the greatest player not named Ty Cobb that I've ever seen.
Yeah, because at that time, that was the beginning of Pete Reiser being heralded as the new Ty Cobb, because the phrase five-tool player had not yet been invented, but Pete Reiser truly was the five-tool player. He could hit with power, he could run, he could field, he could throw, he could do it all. And also here, I think we need to introduce the fact that Pete Reiser could play just about anywhere in the field. He played shortstop and then third base in the minors. And when spring training 1940 rolled around, 21-year-old Pete Reiser, even though he was a sensation in spring training once again, Bill McKechnie, the manager of the defending National League champion Cincinnati Reds, tells him, young man, you are the best third baseman in the league. And Joe McCarthy, the manager of the defending world champion New York Yankees, tells him, young man, we're going to make a deal for you, and you are the Yankee third baseman of the future. But those deals do not happen. Pete returns to Elmira for part of the season, but with 70 games gone, he's batting .370. There's no way he can be denied his shot at the major leagues. And so in mid-season 1940, Pete Reiser, 21 years old, is called up to the Dodgers. But, and this is one of the tragedies of his story and his life, the Brooklyn infield is set. And so Leo DeRocher, seeing his versatility and his natural speed, puts him in center field for the Dodgers. And in half a season, Pete has a pretty darn good year for a rookie, especially a 21-year-old rookie. He bats .293, only has 11 doubles, 4 triples, 3 home runs. He steals a few bases, but the promise is there. Then 1941 rolls around, and Larry MacPhail, the wheeler dealer, he has put together a team. The Dodgers very quickly have risen from the butt of jokes to respectability to pennant contenders, and thanks to deals for veterans like Dixie Walker, Ducky Medwick, Whitlow Wyatt, Dolph Camilli, the Dodgers, Mickey Owen, the Dodgers are in contention for the pennant, but 2 young men are going to be at the heart of that pennant pursuit, 21-year-old Pete Reiser and 22-year-old shortstop Harold Patrick Reiser, another Harold Reiser, Pee-wee, a shortstop purchased from the Louisville Colonels, the top farm club of the Boston Red Sox, because the Red Sox have a player manager named Joe Cronin who doesn't want to make way for this kid. So the pursuit of the pennant begins in 1941, and Pete Reiser has a season for the ages.
Mm-hmm.
And just look at the statistics. He bats .343 for the season. Still, at 22 years old, still, all these decades later, the youngest batting champion in National League history. He leads the National League in runs scored, in doubles, in triples, in slugging average, in total bases. Also, unfortunately, in hit by pitch, which is a sign of a young man who is perhaps reckless, perhaps, it's giving us a clue perhaps of the tragedies to follow. He is named to the All-Star game where nerves perhaps catch up with him a little bit, but he finishes second in the most valuable player voting. His teammate, first baseman Dolph Camilli, wins the MVP award because Dolph leads the league in home runs and runs batted in. And the Dodgers, for the first time in a generation, for the first time in 21 years, are champions of the National League. And how about that? Huh?
Right. Yeah.
Geez, I used a Mel Allen line in a show about the Brooklyn
Dodgers.
That?
Right.
Can I be forgiven? But yeah, really, 21 years. And just a few years before, people were talking about the Dodgers going bankrupt. They were the joke of the National League, the Daffiness Boys.
They were the Daffiness Boys, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Balls hitting outfielders on the head, two runners on the same base.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. The Dodgers have three men on base. Which base?
Right, right. That's the old story. Guy jumps into a taxi cab. And the taxi driver turns around and he says, "Where to?" He says, "What's the score of the game?" Because the game's on the radio. The Dodgers have two men on. He said, "What base?" They did have the reputation of being clowns. Let's face it.
Yeah. And played that up.
Not only did they turn that around, but they turned it around 180 degrees, because from 41 on until 57, their final year in Brooklyn, they were not only good, they were very good. And they won, as you well know, they won in 41, they won in 47, they won in 49, they won in 52, they won in 53, 55, and 56. And, of course, they lost the playoff in 46. They lost on the last game of the season in 50, and they lost to Bobby Thompson and the Giants in 51. So, all things being equal, if a ball bounces here or there, or doesn't bounce here or there, or hooks foul here or there, the Dodgers become the Yankees in that they would win almost every single year and be in the Fall Classic almost every single year. So I give Larry McPhail a lot of credit in Brooklyn, and I hope you do too.
I do, absolutely. He put together a team in very short time that won the National League. He brought Nightball to Brooklyn. He brought Red Barber to Brooklyn. An innovator. To me, Larry McPhail, though, is sort of like the Billy Martin of general managers. He comes in, turns a losing situation around quicker than anyone could expect, but unfortunately, but I think this is just the reality of it, he also wears out his welcome very quickly. And so, perhaps it was Providence that by the end of 1942, Larry McPhail was ready to move on from Brooklyn. But sadly, by then, the great promise of Pistol Pete Reiser was already shattered. And a quote, that I think captures, so much of the Reiser story, and many years later, and how Rickey and McPhail went from allies to being completely estranged, not speaking to anybody. They said years later somebody asks Branch Rickey, well, what do you think about the way MacPhail handled Reiser? And Rickey's comment was, that character should never have been entrusted with anything so fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just let that sink in for a minute. So let's talk about the why. So the Dodgers go to the World Series of 1941, which will always be remembered, unfortunately, for the line drive off of Fat Freddie Fitzsimmons' kneecap, and ultimately the dropped third strike by Mickey Owen. Was it a spitball? Was it a monster curve? You know, to this day, fans are still arguing about it. But the Yankees won, and that was when the Brooklyn Eagle launched the cry of wait till next year.
Right.
Dodger fans, you know, they thought, well, hey, we're just getting started. We've got a winning team, and we've got the best young player in the history of the game, this 22-year-old batting champion, and he's just going to get better. And for a good part of that summer, that is exactly what Pete Reiser did. He tore up the National League. He was batting, I believe he was as high as 380, and then tragedy struck. An extra inning game in St. Louis.
Right.
And the Dodgers, of course, are at St. Louis. It is July 18th, 1942. They've got an 8-game lead. Okay, at that moment, Reiser's batting .356. He is on an 11-game hitting streak. The game's in the 11th inning. It's tied 6-6. Enos Slaughter hits a long drive. Reiser goes racing toward the center field wall. He catches the ball in full stride, and an instant later, he slams into the concrete wall at Sportsman's Park. The ball falls from his glove. He's dazed, but he still picks up the ball, throws to the cutoff man, Pee Wee Reese, but by the time Reese is able to fire the ball home, Slaughter had circled the bases. The Cardinals had won the game, but more significantly, more sadly, Pistol Pete Reiser falls to the ground, unconscious, motionless, his shoulders separated, blood trickling from his ears. Leo DeRocher runs out, and when he sees his great ball player, he begins to cry. Mm-hmm. Pete Reiser, for the first of, I believe, 11 times in his career, is carried off the field on a stretcher. He wakes up the next morning in the hospital with a fractured skull and a concussion. The Cardinals team doctor, who also happens to be his personal doctor, says, "Young man, you do not return for the rest of this baseball season."
Right.
And unfortunately, because, for one thing, the effects of concussions were not nearly as well understood then as they are now.
They were not.
And because not only his own competitive fire, but the competitive fire of Leo DeRocher, the competitive fire of Larry MacPhail, very shortly Reiser is back in the lineup. And July 25th, just a week after this horrific collision, and yet he bats .244 from that point onward.
Right.
He finishes the season where he had peaked at .380 at one point. He finishes the season batting .310. Even though the 1942 Dodgers actually win more games than the 1941 club, they still finish second to those Cardinals.
Yes, they do.
And
let me just let me add one little story.
Sure.
Now we both agree that Pistol Pete was carried off the field 11 times in his career on a stretcher. I am not sure which number it is, but it could very well be the first time, the one that you just described, When
it may
he
have
comes
happened.
back, when the doctor tells him no more baseball for this year, but he defies the doctor. He comes back to Ebbets Field, and DeRocher sees him, and DeRocher says, "How do you feel?" And Pistol Pete says to him, "Well, I feel pretty good." He says, "But the doctor told me I can't play for the rest of the year." And supposedly, the story goes that Leo DeRocher said, "You know something? Why don't you just suit up and sit on the bench?" And it
has a moral support for the team. Yeah.
Right. It will support the team. They'll look at you and they'll think, "Wow, we're going to be okay. But I won't use you. Don't worry about it." But of course, Leo does. He
the first
pinch hit, pinch run, or whatever, and pretty soon he's back in the lineup. Now, like I said, I am not sure if it was the first time, but it was one of those times that that's what happened. And another one of the times, the 11 times, Pistol Pete says that he woke up in the middle of the night in a hospital, in a bed, with his Dodger uniform still on.
Yes.
And he leaves the hospital himself, this was another time, and goes straight to Brooklyn and straight to the ballpark early in the morning, gets in there, has his coffee or bagel or whatever, and he's still in his uniform, and he had just he just woke up from the concussion or he was being out cold, and there he is back in there. So, you know what? You said it 6-7 minutes ago. You said it.
Yeah.
We didn't know anything about concussions back then. We knew zero. We probably know very, very little today also. But at least we're a little bit more educated about concussive problems. But back then, zero, zip, zilch. How you feel, kid? Okay, rub some dirt on it, whatever. And Pistol Pete kept on coming back from all of these times that he ran into the wall. And beanings, too. He did get beaned a few times. He came back over and over and over and over. And I don't want to ruin your story.
That's okay.
But when he runs into these walls, not only does he knock himself out by hitting his head against these walls, but he ruins one of his shoulders.
Exactly.
And he starts batting the opposite way. Now, I don't care how great of an athlete you are, and world-class athletes only make the major leagues. Let's face it. No bank teller just walks into Ebbets Field and starts playing baseball. You have to be quite an athlete. But that being said, to turn around in the middle of a season and say, well, this shoulder hurts, so I'll bat the other way, and actually compete on a major league level, this guy, Reiser, was more than something special.
Oh,
he was
and remember
Superman.
Yeah, remember a couple of minutes ago I mentioned that he hit .244 after coming back from the concussion?
Yep.
Well, here's something else we haven't mentioned yet. You got to remember that he was experiencing double vision all throughout this period. He wasn't telling anybody. He was seeing two baseballs coming up there, and still he manages to hit .244. I mean, in a way, that's as miraculous as anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're nowadays we're trying to get Jock Peterson to hit .244.
Yeah. Right nowadays, a .244 hitter who could, with a little power and a little speed, would probably be a multi-million-dollar player.
No doubt.
Which is, So, we've dwelled on the 41 and 42 seasons, but really, to me, those are the truly crucial seasons in the story of Pistol Pete, because in a way, all the rest of it, sadly, is a curtain call, an afterthought, even though some important things happen. So, are you ready to press on with the rest of the story?
Yes.
Okay, 1942 is over. The Dodgers do not repeat, but of course we have not mentioned yet in this narrative that since December 8th, 1941, the United States has been at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. And even though relatively few major leaguers were lost to the action in 1942, it's clear by 1943 most players are going to do their part. January 1943, so Pistol Pete tries to enlist in the Navy, and he flunks his Navy physical. Are you surprised? Is anybody listening surprised? He's classified 4F. So he goes to an Army recruiting office because we know by now that Pete Reiser is a young man who does not give up easily. He does not take no for an answer easily. The Army is about to turn him away as well. But then an officer recognizes him, waves him through, and he ends up at Fort Riley, Kansas, where he is going to be a star on an Army baseball team. But unfortunately, in training, he develops pneumonia. Well, he recovers from pneumonia, but then even on the Army team, he can't play at anything less than all out. He slams through a 10-foot hedge that is serving as an outfield wall, goes plunging down a 10-foot drainage ditch on the opposite side, separates his shoulder again.
Mm-hmm.
If a man, you would think a man was born under an unlucky star. It's Pistol Pete.
Born under a bad sign, right?
Yeah, an unlucky star, a bad sign, something. But finally, at the beginning of 1946, the right base doctor examines Pete Reiser. He sees his medical records. He's absolutely appalled, says this man should have never been allowed in the Army in the first place. They discharge him just in time to join the Dodgers in spring training. Although Leo DeRocher is still the manager, Larry McPhail is long gone. He had enlisted in the Army himself and actually, and by 1946, is a part owner of the New York Yankees, but that's another story. Branch Rickey has finally been lured to Brooklyn, and at last he is reunited with his precious jewel, but unfortunately his precious jewel is already tarnished. And yet, in 1946, the Dodgers still contend for the pennant, despite all his injuries, despite being away from the majors for 3 seasons. Pistol Pete is a starting outfielder. He appears in 122 games for the Dodgers. He bats .277. He leads the National League with 34 stolen bases, and in fact sets a National League record that still stands by stealing home 7 times in one season.
Yeah, he's tied with someone for that.
Yeah, Rod Carew, as an American leaguer, also managed that feat, I believe, in 1969. But so he tied the Major League record, but Pete still holds the National League record.
Yeah.
And he even manages to finish 9th in the MVP voting that year, and for the third and final time plays in the National League or in the Major League All-Star game.
Right.
So then we roll into 1947, and this is, at age 28, sadly, really the last good season that Pete Reiser ever enjoys.
Right.
Jackie Robinson joins the Dodgers. They're a team in transition, has the semi-regular outfielder appearing in 110 games. He bats .309, but his arm is gone, his speed is gone. DeRocher, the Dodgers make it to the World Series against the Yankees. Pete, has a broken ankle. He goes in, DeRocher sends him in to pinch hit against Floyd Bevins, who is pitching the first no-hitter in World Series history, although, of course, it's broken up. But Pete draws a walk, is replaced. He limps up to the plate, still manages to draw a walk, is replaced by a pinch runner.
Actually, he was intentionally passed.
That's right. Thank you. And that is a rare
potential
case.
winning run. They put the potential. The Yankees did. They put the potential winning run on base, and of course,
that's right.
He proved to be the winning run. It wasn't Reiser. The pinch runner was Eddie Mixis.
Yes. And so there, DeRocher showed his smarts in keeping the world from knowing that Reiser had a broken ankle, but I think that was probably the injury, if there was any, that truly finished Pete as a major leaguer. The next year, that broken shoulder, broken head, broken ankle. I mean, what more can you do to this guy?
If it wasn't so sad, it would be funny.
Yeah, it really would, but it is a true tragedy. I mean, this is really where I think, if William Shakespeare, if we could have transported him into the 20th century and told him to write a tragedy built around baseball, I am sure that Will would have chosen the story of Pistol Pete Reiser.
I believe so.
Yeah. So in 1948, DeRocher is suspended and still suspended, and at least for the beginning. But he comes back. But Pete, truly is done in only 64 games. Most of those as a pinch hitter. He bats an anemic .236. He gets permission from Branch Rickey to make a deal for himself, which he does. He ends up going to the Boston Braves for 2 years, has one decent year, one terrible year. In 1951, he is reunited with Rickey in Pittsburgh, has a spare outfielder for the Pittsburgh Pirates, but the Pirates cut him loose in 1952. He is signed at age 33 with the Cleveland Indians, and partway into the season, batting .208, he is given his unconditional release, and Pete Reiser, who should have played into his 40s, who should have set all kinds of amazing records, is done with baseball at the far too young age of 33.
Sad.
So, life after baseball for Pete. Very briefly,
let's talk about that. He became a coach, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, first he went into the car business for a few months.
Oh, okay.
And even though he had some success, much like Gil Hodges and other players who were selling cars, he quickly found, he was not satisfied by that life. And Buzzy Bavasi came calling and offered him a job actually first as a minor league manager. And so he spent the second half of the 1950s managing in the Dodgers farm system. And
Spokane Dodgers, was it?
Well, his final stop, no, he never ended up in Spokane. That comes later. But in 1959, he is manager of the Victoria Rosebuds of the AA Texas League. And Victoria had finished last the year before he took the helm. And in 1959, they win it all, and Pete's named minor league manager of the year. That earns him a shot at the coaching staff for Walter Alston. And for the next 5 years, 1960 to 64, Pete Reiser is back with the Dodgers, now in Los Angeles as a coach. 1965 was the year he was going to go to Spokane. But here we have to introduce the sad fact, like so many men of his generation, Pete became hooked on cigarettes, and he was a heavy,
like Gil Hodges,
smoker.
Right?
Yep, like Gil Hodges, like Billy Loes, like so many of them. And in 1965, he suffers a heart attack. He's not able to run Spokane. Duke Snyder ends up taking over Spokane. Duke had retired as a player just the year before.
I have a picture of the Duke. I have a picture of the Duke in a Spokane uniform.
Yep, I've seen that one too. Yep. And that season was enough to teach Duke that managing wasn't for him. But Pete had recovered well enough by 1966 that after a decade off the field, Leo DeRocher was back in the game, and he took over the Chicago Cubs, and Pete joined his coaching staff. He spent, I believe, 3 seasons with Leo. Then he became a coach for the California Angels for a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Then he went back to the Cubs and Leo, and that was the end of his major league coaching career. But he was Leo's third base coach. When Leo was absent for any reason, Pete ran the club, so, that's a sign of the respect that DeRocher had for Pete's baseball acumen. And so, mid-1970s, unfortunately, in his mid-50s, Pete's done with baseball, and then just a few years later, I believe 1981 or 1982, at the age of 62, the toll of cigarettes catches up with him, and at age 62, Pete Reiser passes away from respiratory illness, and the story ends. But the legend lives on.
The legend does live on.
And will live on forever. Yeah.
Not that it means a hill of beans, but I just mention it anyway. When I was a little kid, I was born in 1946, okay? I've said that on this show many times. So by the time I was born and knew about the Dodgers, Pete Reiser was out of baseball for all intents and purposes. I became a fan in 55, late 54 and then 55, and Pete Reiser was gone. He was no longer a Dodger, but all the men in my family, my uncles, I was the youngest in my family, so my sisters are older than I am. My brother is older than I am. And whenever they would talk about the Dodgers, especially one of my brothers-in-law, Tommy Smith, he used to tell me, I know you love Duke Snider, and I know you think that Duke Snider is really great, and he is, and I know you're jealous of Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays, and it was the old Willie, Mickey, and the Duke in New York back then. And I was a little boy, and I thought Snider was the greatest thing since sliced bread. But my brother-in-law kept insisting. We used to watch Dodger games together on a little black and white TV down the cellar. He used to say, Peter, if you ever saw Pete Reiser play, and when I was very young, I thought he was talking about Pee Wee Reese, because even though he was saying Pete Reiser, for some reason my dumb head equaled Pee Wee Reese. I didn't know that the Dodgers could have a guy named Reese and a guy named Reiser. So I thought I thought he was mispronouncing Pee Wee Reese. I had no clue. Talk about ignorant. Anyway, when I finally started to learn about Pete Reiser, then I sought him out, my brother-in-law, and asked him to tell me stories. And he said, you wouldn't believe the stories that I could tell you. He said, I sat in Ebbets Field more than a few times, and I just saw things that I didn't believe that I saw, even though I saw them right in front of my face. I didn't believe the throw he would make. I wouldn't believe when he would steal home. I wouldn't believe a catch he would make. I wouldn't believe a clutch home run or a clutch double or whatever that he could do, or even a bunt. All the things that he could do better than anyone I ever saw, until, of course, he hurt himself over and over and over. And, on Facebook, when you made it Pete Reiser Week or Pete Reiser Month, whatever, people were coming up with these quotes from Casey Stengel and from other people about how the greatest player I ever saw, not named Ty Cobb, was Pete Reiser, and he had everything that Willie Mays had, and blah, blah, blah. All of these quotes and stuff, they're all true. This guy was a sensation. He was just terrific. And like you said many minutes ago, about 35 minutes ago, if he had stayed a shortstop or a third baseman, he just might have been a Hall of Famer with over 4,000 hits, with a 366 lifetime average, with 11 batting titles. And as fanciful as those numbers appear to be, he was so good and so talented that it's not out of the realm of possibility that he could have achieved that. Yes, those numbers.
Yes, it
That's
really
how good he was.
is. Yes, indeed. And so we will just have to look and contemplate and wonder what might have been. What might have been.
We will do that. It was a sensational story that you unraveled here tonight. I want to thank you. And
for the opportunity.
Before you started talking about Pistol Pete, I gave one or two funny stories. I think they were funny anyway.
Yes.
About a Dodger right-hander named Billy Loes, and I might have one left.
I was hoping you did, because
I think I might.
Story of
here's something that's not funny, but it's very interesting. Billy Loes is the only player in Major League history to have witnessed a player involved in hitting 4 home runs in a game 4 times.
Oh, wow.
Okay. He was a teammate of Gil Hodges in 1950 when Gil hit 4 in a game. He was a Dodger in 1954 when against Brooklyn, Joe Adcock hit 4 home runs in a game. He was a member of the Baltimore Orioles in 1959 when Rocky Colavito hit 4 home runs in a game. And as a Giant, in 61, he saw Willie Mays hit 4 home runs in a game.
Fantastic.
Isn't that something else?
That is.
And now for the funny story. Okay. A lot of people know half of this story.
Okay.
I was among them. And as it unravels, it's a very short story. As it unravels, you will be cognizant of it also, Mr. Bill Hall. Okay.
Okay.
In one of the before one of the World Series, either 52 or 53, I think it was the 53 World Series.
Mm-hmm.
A writer asked Billy Loes for his prediction who would win the World Series.
Yes.
And Billy Loes, a Dodger starting pitcher, and I would have to say a star of the team, said Yankees in 6. And everyone, of course, laughed, and that story had legs that run to this very day. But the end of that story is even better, because right before Billy Loes died, he was interviewed and asked about that quote. Billy, why before the 1953 World Series, when asked for your prediction, could you ever say, my prediction is the Yankees in 6? And Billy Loes said, I was misquoted. And the writer said, oh, okay. And then Billy said, I picked the Yankees in 7.
Oh, I love it.
Isn't that great?
Yep.
He was quite a character.
Yep.
Well, Bill Hall, we're come to the end of another show. I want to thank you very much for coming on with me again. And like I say every time you come on, don't be a stranger. And you have an open door policy with Comfortably Zoned Radio, and especially with me on A Tale of Two Cities, Brooklyn to Los Angeles. You are more than welcome to come on at any time. And I hope you don't get sick of me every other week almost, me asking you, when are you available? When can you come on and talk about so-and-so? And I hope you don't roll your eyes and say, what's the matter with this guy? Can't he do a show or 2 or 3 or 4 without me? But we really love you here.
What's going on in my mind is I can't wait to be invited back, or saying, well, gee, I haven't heard from the guys in a few weeks. Maybe I better give them a call, because
that's really nice to heir.
Because I hope you know how much I consider you a friend. I consider the great Ronnie Rabinovitz, Jackie's friend, a friend. And you know how much I love. The only thing I love more than reading about and thinking about the Brooklyn Dodgers is talking about the Brooklyn Dodgers.
There you go. There you go.
Certainly happy to do that anytime.
That's very nice of you to say that, Bill Hall, and I really appreciate it very, very much. And you will be invited back many more times. And you always do a superb job. I never get off the air with you and think back and say, Bill didn't cover this portion, or he didn't cover that portion. You have all the bases covered, including home plate, and I thank you for it, my friend. And once again, let's thank you, and let's just say good night to all our listeners, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much, and good night.
Okay.